I've towards the conclusion, I'll talk about
Right.
what we'll
Okay.
deal
Go ahead.
with this new normal. Yes. So, well, thank you for having me, Doctor. It's much appreciated. And it's appreciated to see 148 people. It's odd to speak to a crowd and never actually see them. So it'll take a little bit of getting used to. Um, yes, I want to start with talking about how cities have always been shaped by disease. Um, so we know that the ancient Turkmen city of Merv, which was the first settlement in history to have 1 million residents, right? This is in 1200 AD, Christian era, had 1 million residents. And it checked everybody entering the city for disease. This is plague, cholera. And if somebody was diseased, they didn't get through the city's great gates into Merv. We also know that in times of plague, Venice made outsiders wait 40 days before entering its territories. So this is throughout all the Adriatic coast, right? And this is how we get the word quarantine. It comes from the Venetian phrase for 40 days, quaranta giorni, right? So planning for disease has always been a part of everyday life. As a matter of fact, mundane design objects like gutters, sewers, and public parks, they exist to prevent disease. So in a lot of ways, planning is more about public health and wellness than economic development. And with this new normal, COVID-19, cities are going to have to return their focus to wellness and the public good. Otherwise, we're going to have more economic disruptions like we are experiencing right now. Let me give another example, right? In 1958, the City of London had 3 cholera outbreaks. And to halt the spread of the disease, the city began a public works project to expand sewers. And if you look at the locations of those sewers today, that's Oxford Road, Chelsea, and Southwark, you will find that they are all in London's richest neighborhoods. So where you plan for wellness and the public good, you have economic development. Or to put it as an equation, wellness comes before development. So what's my advice, right? I'm an ethnographer. I look at how people interact and form social relationships. I'm also an expert on temporary use as a long-term planning strategy. And from all of my knowledge, everything I've learned, I can tell you that everything actually happens twice, gradually and suddenly. So what do I mean by this gradually and suddenly? Right? All of you are planners. So look at your own work. You spend years learning to be a planner. Then you spend years going to meetings and working ideas about what a city needs to be. Then suddenly all of your work comes together and you see what you've done, right? That's the sudden, suddenly it's there. Or look at what generations of planners have done in Dubai, Shanghai, Berlin, where years and years and years of groundwork have allowed the cities to boom. So the small things that planners do about wellness now in this new normal will suddenly have a big impact on a city's economic future. But we also should need to talk about what happens when you have the sudden without the gradual. And look at Ahmedabad in India, right? The city was built suddenly in the past 50 years, and planners were never allowed to gradually design for wellness. So the city does not have the capacity to support its residents. And what has happened since COVID-19? Workers have actually started to leave the city. Yes, the jobs are disappearing because the economy is failing, but the economy is failing because the city cannot manage a viral outbreak. So again, planners need to always design for wellness over development. I will also tell you that based on my work on temporary use, good things happen in places that are cheap, flexible, and central. And these 3 elements are constants when you have to do something different without building new infrastructure. Cheap is self-explanatory. Money is always going to be saved when rents and other services are low cost. Flexibility allows places to be used for a variety of functions and refit without investing in new infrastructure. And centrality makes it easy for people to come together, right? But this new normal, this COVID-19 era, or when we'll have post-COVID-19, I'm really reconsidering what it means to be central. Without social distance, busy streets, markets, and nightclubs will be vectors for transmission. Therefore, we need to rethink the idea of urban proximity. And the word I think we need to use is local, which is more of a way of, which is my way of actually of saying that a city has to have multiple centers and more dispersed amenities. Since COVID-19, we know that it's safer if people stay at home. We also know that people do not have to commute to work. Plus, the lockdowns show that people can make do with shopping, leisure, and services close to home. So when cities get back to their ordinary function, it will be easier for planners to make the case that cities can be more local, livable, and socially distanced. So how do we make a city more local? First, we don't need big ideas or new infrastructure. Rather, it can be as simple as finding temporary or meanwhile uses for what we already have. Let's return to what I said a few minutes ago about meanwhile values such as thrift and flexibility. We start at the local level by gradually making streets more shared, either for pedestrians or even as temporary cafes or places of business. We should also make better use of open spaces, like empty lots as temporary venues that can be used as parks or community kitchens. I think of in India or Turkey where they have tandoori ovens. Plus, we can never let storefronts, factories, or houses sit empty for more than a few months. Otherwise, we're actually wasting spaces and opportunities to get something done immediately. The second thing we need to think of with these new decentered locales, we need to think of them as 15-minute cities. And the measure of wellness will be whether a person has access to everything they need within a 15-minute walk of their front door. Does it take 15 minutes to go to the grocer? Does it take 15 minutes to walk to work? Can the kids get to school in 15 minutes? And do people have 15 minutes to help a neighbor, right? So it's a measure of time. If we're commuting, we can't help our neighbors. We can't relate. I know that there's always going to be exceptions to this, that some people have to transit across cities, but there's no reason that people should have to cross the city or lose hours of their day. Third, the goal of a 15-minute city is to make urban life more livable, right, by reducing pollution and stress. And these are comorbidities, I will always have a hard time at that word, comorbidities that are linked to COVID-19 deaths. Again, as I said at the very beginning of the talk, cities have always been shaped by disease. So there is no reason that the opposite can be true, and diseases can be shaped by cities. More specifically, we can make it harder to transmit and die from diseases by improving the health of our cities. We can do this by emphasizing wellness over development. Finally, I'm sure all of you will want to see what a 15-minute city looks like. And I'm going to say that you should look at cities like Munich or Melbourne. But those cities look nothing like Colombo or Kandy, right? But I will tell you that there are multiple wellness strategies that you can implement in Sri Lanka right now. I think I can give you 3 examples that actually come from my home village in Bavaria, Germany. The village is called Eichstatt. It has a population of 13,000 people, all of whom can walk to each other's homes or to work or school in less than 15 minutes. The village's buildings are also a mix of old and new, with many of the buildings, it's more than 60% of the buildings, being more than 400 years old. Eichstatt also has modern amenities and places of work, including call centers and factories. So within a 15-minute city, you have more than 10,000 people and a mix of residential, commercial, and industrial spaces, as well as schools and services. And as a consequence, the city has a slower pace of life, reduced stress, and no comorbidities, and some of the lowest unemployment in Germany, right? So everything in this town is a little bit slower, a little bit easier. As for the strategies that Eichstatt uses, planners have been unusually proactive about introducing participatory consultation and budgeting as a way of improving community wellness. One example is the planner's use of temporary permits that allow for social activities proposed by community members. So whereas an interest generally submits a complete application for a permit and leaves the work for planners, the community members in Eichstatt can actually submit a rough idea to planners. And the planners will then work with the community members to find a location and organizational partners and even help complete planning applications. And this system is better than most conventional methods because ordinary people can have a direct role in decision making, right? They're actually proposing the ideas instead of the planners digging for ideas. Plus, this treats planning as a network of relationships where feelings of belonging and cooperation flourish. This is a form of wellness. Another example is Project Leergut, in which the city has created an office within its planning department that is dedicated to finding short-term occupants for empty storefronts. This office functions a bit like an estate agent and has the capacity to broker and subsidize rents. In many cases, it has convinced property owners to allow artists and community groups to have access to empty spaces rent-free. 50% of the spaces they deal with have no rent. And what I think is most interesting about Project Leergut is that it's committed to promoting wellness without development, as it works with material and spaces that are already available. So in addition to promoting reuse, it is allowing for community wellness to precede development. And finally, since COVID-19 and this new normal, Eichstatt is finding ways to use social distance to allow for a gradual return to everyday life. Like most European cities, the village has multiple piazzas, and they're all allowing restaurants and cafes to use the piazzas for public seating. The village is also allowing bars and cafes to create hybrid social spaces in streets and alleys where patrons can gather whilst maintaining social distance. Plus, Eichstatt is allowing the farmers market to expand from 2 days a week to 3, And the spaces have been spread from one piazza to all of the city streets and into parks and alleyways, which turns the town into a socially distanced public space. So yeah, to wrap it up, what is my point when I give you all these details? COVID-19 has taught me that we need to slow down everything when it comes to building a city. So we need to look a lot less at what a city will suddenly look like when it is built, and we need to truly care about what the gradual work is going to take to make cities healthier and more livable. I also think that we need to focus on what needs to be done to transition between the gradual and sudden. I think we can do this by using buildings, streets, and resources that are already available in every city. And finally, I think we need to focus a lot more on the local. So yeah, I think that we can have meanwhile strategies that are cheap, flexible, and central. But my definition of central now means that work and amenities are local and within 15 minutes of home. Hopefully that makes sense and I can clear this up as we go. I think that that's the key to moving forward, is that a lot of cities around the world, so like I live in Edmonton right now. Edmonton focused on building a train system that is going to get everybody into the city center. I used to live in Nottingham, United Kingdom, same thing. The train system went to the city center. Edmonton is actually reversing the system, and they're now trying to build multiple city centers. When the idea was proposed by the master of the city plan, she had a hard time arguing for that. People were, it's going to cost too much. And her argument is that you look at the most successful cities around the world, the cities that grew the best, they were always a collection of villages, right? So I was raised partly in Dublin. Dublin is a collection of 17 different villages that were connected by a green belt. London is a connection of 30 different councils that have eventually grown into the megapolis of London. So it's not impossible for us to have these multiple city centers, for us to have these 15-minute cities. Paris is the same thing. Berlin's 5 different cities that have grown into one. It's actually oddly in the developing world. I know Colombo is actually very different, and Colombo is really the only Sri Lankan city I know well, in that it actually does have many cities or villages around it that have grown into one, Colombo. But in the developing world, it was the growth of the megacity in the 1970s and 80s, and then they really boomed. So I talked about Ahmedabad, where Manse is, and that city just boomed in the 90s, right? I mean, it went from 500,000 people in 1960 to 5.5 million, and now I think it's actually decreasing in size. And these are these cities that are not planned. And so oddly, the cities that started as villages, like Colombo, are slightly better planned. It was actually just the development, as the Americans would have called it in the 1970s, that changed everything in the way that we look at these cities. Maybe you can speak to that better than I can, Monse. I think that so that was like a popular idea in the 1980s, was the idea of bioregions, that cities needed to be broken down into these or states needed to be broken down into these bioregions. And that was an idea that I remember when I was in graduate school in the early 2000s was seen as dumb and strange. But it's true. Like when you look at the colonial model, right, it was built for train lines, and it was built from the train line directly from the coast into the mine or to the like tea fields in Sri Lanka. And that system just cut across rivers, right? And they could care less about rivers, which ended up in being pollution, because downstream they didn't care. They didn't care about the people who lived along the stream, upstream or downstream. And so, yeah, I think you're exactly right, that actually building around the water and allowing the water to flow freely is going to improve quality of life significantly. My problem is that in my examples I was using is actually factories, is that factories are still going to be polluting. We can have high hopes for better batteries. So we're going to have to clean up the technologies that we use for developing these communities. The other example I was going to talk about actually is that some of you may have lived in Sheffield, England. Sheffield, England was quite unique because it had, instead of horizontal integration or vertical integration of its companies, they were actually horizontally integrated. So you would have a house next to a factory, next to a community center, next to a grocery store. And this model existed until the 1930s in Sheffield. It was a very successful model. And in fact, it was when they shifted to the vertical integration of the company and of the steel industry in Sheffield that the city actually collapsed, and it was very easy for the city to fall apart. And so it's these models of this kind of expanded system of decentralized and kind of more horizontal integration of cities has always existed. It's only been 70 years that we moved to this vertical integration of cities, started building straight upward. It's, you know, so my parents in their memory, they can remember what these cities look like. It's not too distant.